Hello and welcome. I am Shahin Jurampati. Well, since the inception of the new government of President Maithripala Sirisena and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, Sri Lanka, a country once internationally isolated, has now begun to regain the assistance of its international partners. New Zealand is one such country. So today we are in discussion with the Prime Minister of New Zealand himself, Mr. John Key. Hello and welcome, Prime Minister. Thank you very much for joining us.
No problem, Shahin. Nice to be here.
Prime Minister Key, first things first. What is the purpose of your visit to Sri Lanka?
Twofold. So firstly, as you pointed out, the diplomatic relations between Sri Lanka and the rest of the world have been dramatically improving over recent years. So the first is just to have an opportunity to come and speak to the new government. We've been doing some commercial things as well with Fonterra, our big dairy factory or big dairy company, having a model farm that was established in Penala today, so we were there. And I'm also chairman of all of the centre-right political parties around the world. They have a governing body, and we're meeting in Sri Lanka in a couple of days' time. So it's multi-purpose, but great to be here. I was last here in 2013 for Commonwealth Heads of Government, so it's good to be back.
Prime Minister Key, you've met the President and the Prime Minister. What were the outcomes of these meetings?
Primarily talking about how we can strengthen the relationship together. I think there are many things that we can do. So we're obviously keen over time to see a reduction in the tariffs that our companies pay, particularly our dairy company coming into Sri Lanka. But that's really primarily because we see huge growth and opportunity in this market, and we think more New Zealand goods coming into this market can be used to grow actually as part of the manufacturing and production chain, if you like, as part of growing tourism. So we've been talking about that, talking about ways that we can work together more efficiently in the years to come. We see Sri Lanka as a place that's very much on the move, go ahead and progressive, and so this is a great opportunity for us to grow off what's a strong and long-term base here, but to do even better and to see more investment from Sri Lanka into New Zealand.
Now, as you mentioned, Mr. Prime Minister, New Zealand and Sri Lanka share a $324 million trade relationship of 45 years. Given the fact that New Zealand's main production sector is in the dairy industry, how do you think the government of New Zealand will ensure that quality products enter the Sri Lankan market or the subcontinent?
Yeah, I mean, we are known obviously for the quality of what we produce. So we produce probably the highest quality dairy products in the world and agricultural products, and that's why we can get a premium for what we sell. And very big markets like China, we're their largest supplier. The largest supplier by far of infant baby formula, for instance, into China, but right across the world. I mean, I think the big challenge for us is how do we really add value here in Sri Lanka? It's one thing for us to go and sell a range of products here, but can we actually help Sri Lanka itself grow? And that's really what the model farm's been about. We're not here to put Sri Lankan farmers out of business, quite the opposite. We're actually here to add value and to see if we can lift their productivity. So a dairy cow here in Sri Lanka produces about 4 litres of milk. The equivalent comparison is about 5 times that out of New Zealand. And if we can see Sri Lankan farmers far more productive, then they'll employ more people, they'll produce more product, and as your demand grows, more of it can be fulfilled from your local supply, and we can have an involvement in that, but also as part of our, I guess, responsibility as a sort of a good international citizen. We're keen to work alongside Sri Lanka, and we do that actually around the world, from China right through to parts of Europe.
Prime Minister Key, a couple of years ago, there was a scare in Sri Lanka in terms of the milk powder.
Yeah.
How has the situation progressed so far?
Yeah, I mean, the concerns there were really around something we were doing in relation to methane and nitrate emissions. So our farmers were putting a particular product actually on their soil. And it showed up very, very tiny traces of a thing called DCD. In fact, actually, the levels it was there, it was never harmful. It was just that we don't bother actually having that as built into our tolerances, if you like, because we don't have DCD. Other parts of the world do. So there was never an issue in terms of food safety, and we probably have the highest level of food safety standards and testing in the world because we just know that consumer confidence in our products is paramount if we're going to continue to be such a big supplier. So we always inform our markets. We informed Sri Lanka at the time when that took place. There was a little concern at the time about what it might mean, but I think when we had an opportunity to take everyone through it, then they were much more comfortable.
Prime Minister Key, when we say New Zealand, it is a given that many of our Sri Lankans, the first thing that pops in their head is milk. So, since your arrival here, do you think you could bring anything new to the dairy industry here in Sri Lanka?
We can bring a huge amount of technology. So the reason that we can produce milk at 5 times the rate that a farmer can here in Sri Lanka is because what we've done over time is we've taken away all of the subsidies, all of the support of our farmers, and they've really had to compete on their own 2 feet. And so to do that, they've had to employ the best, or deploy the very best technology, the very best science in the world. And that is exportable, that technology. So that's really what we can bring, which is how do you get the maximum supply coming out of your cow, how do you have the cleanest and best conditions for milking them, animal husbandry, what are the very best techniques, ultimately climate change, an area where we're investing, how can we export that technology. So there's a great many things that we can do, and it's a sort of win-win situation, if you like. You know, we're seen as a stronger partner, but equally it's very, very effective for your farmers.
Prime Minister K, the last time you were here was in 2013 to attend the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, a move which was highly criticized in your country, urging you to boycott the meeting as the Canadian Prime Minister did. It's been 3 years since then. How do you see Sri Lanka progress during these 3 years?
I mean, firstly, we didn't actually agree with the view that that the Canadian Prime Minister of the time, Stephen Harper, should boycott, because in the end, the Commonwealth Heads of Government is hosted in a variety of different locations. We don't always agree with every single policy that a particular government might have, but by going to that meeting, we continue to build on the family of Commonwealth countries, of which Sri Lanka is one of them. And secondly, Sri Lanka was going through and is continuing to go through a significant process of reform. I mean, what I've noticed in the last 2.5 years since I've been here is firstly, the reconciliation is going ahead at a fast pace. I think a lot of work is going into making sure that we have a sustainable, harmonious future for all of the participants and stakeholders, so that's very important. The second thing is it's just very obvious that you become more prosperous and more buoyant. I mean, we're here in Colombo, you only need to walk 100 metres either side of this hotel and you can see just how much construction and infrastructure is being built. So there's no question that Sri Lanka is on the move, and I think your new government is quite progressive in terms of its economic policies, and we're very supportive of what we see them doing.
So would you say that you are happier to be here today rather than you were last time?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's nice to be back. I mean, when I came here in 2013, I wasn't sure what to expect. I've been to a lot of parts of Asia, but I'd never been to Sri Lanka before. I was actually pretty impressed back in 2013, but coming back now, you can really feel the vibrancy. I mean, I represent the body that represents centre-right governments, so by definition, you know, the Prime Minister's from a centre-right party, and so we're very supportive of what they're doing. But we can genuinely see the President and the Prime Minister working on reform policies. And if you think about a country like New Zealand, we're a very small country, 4.5 million people. I always say we're at the bottom of the earth, no one owes us a living. And so for us to succeed, we need the very, very best public policy. Well, in a lot of ways, Sri Lanka is bordered by countries, or at least in the region of countries, that are highly populated, India, China and the likes. And so Sri Lanka won't win because its population is large, because by definition at 21 million it's much smaller. You'll succeed by having the very best public policy. And that's about being open and competitive, deploying good technology, educating your people, building the best infrastructure, developing free trade agreements to ensure that your products can be taken to other markets.
Prime Minister K, on to the UN resolution which Sri Lanka co-sponsored in September last year. What is the New Zealand government's stance on that? Well,
we supported that. It happened, I think, October, November of last year. We're on the Security Council this year and next year, or last year and this year, as you may recall. And we were very pleased to see the resolution, which was really pushing forward the reconciliation that's taking place here. And then this was a civil war that went on for the better part of 30 years. You know, an enormous number of people lost their lives. It was a huge issue, obviously, for the people of Sri Lanka, and it caused, you know, much heartache and grief and loss for so many families and so many individuals. And so the process that you're going through now is always going to be a challenging one, because people ultimately have to let go and to forgive and to look forward. And even in a country like New Zealand that was settled peacefully through a treaty in 1840, we ourselves are still going through a process of dealing with some of the grievances that legitimately are held because we didn't honour all the things. So every country has its own issues, but Sri Lanka is putting its best foot forward, I think, to resolve those issues.
Prime Minister Key, so where do you see Sri Lanka in 5 years from now?
More prosperous than it is today, slightly larger population. I think the challenge actually for the region is that you've got some very big players, China and India. What's clear is that India is trying to grow rapidly, and the question is whether Prime Minister Modi will be able to pass enough of his reforms, because he ultimately needs to get control of his lower and upper house. For China, they're going through their own series of changes. They're moving away from an export and an investment-led economy to a consumption-led economy, one more dominated by services. And so that change will put some pressure on the Asian region because they'll have probably less economic demand initially. And so the challenge for Sri Lanka is, can it deal with all of those big players around it but ultimately continue to grow? And I think you've got the recipe for all the things you need to do. So I would be amazed in 5 years if you weren't even more vibrant, more buoyant, more obviously wealthy, and that's what you've seen in countries like Singapore. I first lived there in 1995. When I go back to Singapore today, 20 years on, it just looks a vastly different place, and more hotels, more infrastructure, just more signs of wealth, and that's what's happening before our eyes here in Colombo at the moment and will continue to occur.
Prime Minister Key, back to the whole UN resolution debacle. There is a large Sri Lankan population residing in New Zealand. When you visited Sri Lanka in 2013, did you consider their plight, their decisions, their attitude towards this matter?
We did. I mean, in the end, as I said, we go to lots of countries where there might be disagreements or disputes or things that we don't necessarily agree with. I mean, we go to a number of countries where their human rights record is very different from New Zealand, or they adopt the death penalty and we don't support that, or they do things that are just quite different to what we do in New Zealand. Our view is that the very best way to see a peaceful and harmonious world is actually, for the most part, to engage with countries. I mean, yes, if they really won't have democracy and won't allow people to have a voice, when we express our views about that, but ultimately we try and build working relationships with countries. Interesting enough, before I came to Sri Lanka back in 2013, quite a number of representatives, including from the Tamil community in New Zealand, came to see me, and they were supportive of me coming to Sri Lanka. They were actually quite proud of their country. They'd now come to make their home in New Zealand, but they had fond memories or family or a belief that Sri Lanka was putting its best foot forward. So there was never any domestic pressure on me not to come to Sri Lanka.
When President Sirisena visited Germany recently, he was of the notion, and he called out to all Sri Lankans residing in all parts of the world who fled during the conflict in Sri Lanka. He called out on them and told them, come back to Sri Lanka, it's safe. In your eyes, what do you say?
Well, I would say that it's very difficult when people immigrate because they often, they have to cut their ties and they come to a new country. Often children are born, say for instance, in our country, and so they see themselves as obviously Sri Lankan, but Sri Lankan New Zealanders. There will definitely be people over time who will say, I'm going to come back to Sri Lanka, the country's changed, the situation's now stable and calm, and the civil war has ended, and so on the back of that there's an opportunity for them to come back and renew all of the history that they had with Sri Lanka. I think for a great many of them they'll probably stay in New Zealand. It won't be because they don't have a love of Sri Lanka, but because they've established a new home. And if you look at my case, my mother was Austrian, my father was English. In the 1950s they came out to New Zealand. It didn't mean they didn't have an affection for the country they came from, but ultimately, I was born in New Zealand, my sister was, became our home. But what you can do is use those people-to-people connections to really build a stronger relationship. So Sri Lankan New Zealanders can help tie a much stronger relationship between New Zealand and Sri Lanka, just as when New Zealanders come and live in your country, they are the bonds that glue us together, because in the end it's the people that actually make the relationship more often than not.
Just an improvised question. Would you maybe come to Sri Lanka on vacation maybe sometime?
Well, the Prime Minister's invited me, actually. I'd love to come. I like playing golf, and you've got nice golf courses. I love spicy food, and you have fantastic food. And it's a very beautiful place. Actually, my niece came here some years ago, and she cycled around Sri Lanka. It was a fundraising thing, I think, for cancer. And she worked for a law firm in the UK, and they had a big thing where they cycled around. And I'm not sure, it took weeks, but they had a fantastic time, raised a lot of money. So, yeah, we'll most certainly come back here on holiday at some point and enjoy it. And that's the trouble when you come on a state visit or the sorts of things I do. You're here for 48 hours, it's difficult to get out of the hotel
How
too much.
much of cameras around you?
Well, you just don't get to see the things everybody else gets to see. And yeah, I love this part of the world. The people are very friendly, and I say the food's great, and you feel safe here actually. So I'd be more than happy to come back.
Prime Minister, back onto a serious note. The recent growing concern around the world is the fight against terrorism, and more accurately speaking, the fight against Islamic State. What role is New Zealand playing in this fight against Islamic State?
I think we're playing the most realistic role that we can, which is to say, firstly, we have sent some of our forces to Iraq to train Iraqi forces so they're in a better position themselves to fight Islamic State. And we're in a place called Taji Air Base. We're alongside the Australians, the Americans are there as well. And we've been very successful, so we've trained now thousands of Iraqi soldiers.
Are these combatant troops?
The troops that are training them are, well, they're just trainers, so we don't go outside beyond the wire, but the people they're training are very much on the front line. And in fact, some of the people they trained were responsible for taking back Ramadi recently. So they're doing very good work there. And I think the second thing we're doing is we are part of an intelligence sharing network with the Americans and the Brits and the Australians and the Canadians. And so again, we try and share information where that makes sense. Thirdly, as part of the Security Council now, we're working with other like-minded countries to do everything we can. And I suppose the last thing we're doing is just doing everything we can to protect our own citizens, because even though we're a long way away, we in New Zealand have people that may look to leave, we have people that may look to raise money, we have some people we know that have gone to Syria and Iraq to fight with Islamic State and may potentially return and present the risk that all foreign fighters do.
Prime Minister, if I may recall, last year you made a very stern statement in Parliament where you lashed out at the opposition, asking them to get some guts. What kind of a statement is that?
Well, actually, I think it was an accurate one, if you want my view, because interestingly enough, we thought the opposition was really playing politics with what was a very important issue, which is how does a country like New Zealand, in all good conscience, sit back and do absolutely nothing when you see people like Islamic State undertaking some of the most barbaric behaviour we've seen in modern times. I mean, these are people that are beheading people, they're kidnapping people, they're executing people because they're gay, they're undertaking massive atrocities that I don't think, as a leader of a country, and I don't think New Zealand's ever stood back and not taken its responsibilities seriously. And it would be akin, I think, to saying when we saw some of the other terrible atrocities around the world that New Zealand would just be a bystander for that, when that's not possible. Primarily because A, there's some domestic risk, although it's pretty small, but our people travel around the region. We're involved in these things whether we like it or not. Interesting enough, actually, by the end of last year, the opposition leader changed his tune and started saying not only should we be sending trainers, although he wouldn't actually say that, what he says we should be sending our special combat troops, our SAS, our elite fighting forces to Iraq, which actually I don't support, because I think in the end Iraq actually has to fight its own battles. I think if we have our soldiers, that won't help things.
Prime Minister, a quick question before we wrap up. There's also a huge debate in your country on a new flag.
Yes.
Some want the flag to remain the same, while some want change. I believe there's a public referendum coming up next month.
There is.
What do you want?
Well, I want change. I desperately want change. So the new flag that we're promoting is actually the one I'm wearing at the moment, which is very similar to our old flag, but it has the silver fern, not the Union Jack. And it's not because I'm not a big monarchist. Actually, I don't want New Zealand to become a republic. I like it having the Queen as head of state. But if you look at the Sri Lankan flag, you fly it proudly everywhere. I mean, you have to be in your country for 5 minutes and you see your flag everywhere. in New Zealand, I think we don't use our flag in the way that other countries do, in the way that you do, in the way that, for instance, India does, or in the way that America or the United Kingdom use their flag, or Canada. And many, many countries change. I mean, as you know, your own flag has changed. And so I think New Zealand should change to have the silver fern, which is much more reflective of who we are and more inclusive of what is now a very multicultural society. Change is always difficult, so it's not to say it's impossible, but it's quite a battle to get there. I think if New Zealanders sit there and think about it, they'll vote for change. But we're the first country ever in the world to ask its population whether it wants to change its flag. Normally countries just get up and do it. So that makes a difficult thing, because people are always historically nervous of change and a little hesitant of change. So we have to continue to make those arguments. But I'm hopeful we'll get there, and I think it's a possibility, but it's definitely going to be a long, hard fight before the vote is over.
Prime Minister Key, I think we're running out of time, but before we wrap up quickly, what would you take back to New Zealand from Sri Lanka?
Ironically, we're taking back an elephant to match the other one we have at Auckland Zoo. But look, I'll just take back memories, I think, of the fact that I'm seeing real progress in your country. I think you should be proud of Sri Lanka. It's doing well. As you said, there's been plenty of challenges, but actually the important point is, what is the future for Sri Lanka? And I think it's a very bright one. So I'm coming away far more confident that Sri Lanka is on the right track.
Right, thank you very much, Prime Minister Key. It's an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for having me on the show.